Okay, we spent the first couple weeks talking about the rise and fall of Jim Crow, the civil rights movement, as part of the struggle for equality in the United States. The civil rights movement was only one part of this larger struggle. As we're going to discuss over the next two lectures, women and other minorities in this country witnessed what was happening with African Americans and sought to build off their achievements of constitutional amendments and civil rights legislation to achieve greater equality in this country. Think about what has happened recently with the growth of the Me Too movement. This is a movement largely against sexual harassment and assault. It began when the actress Alyssa Milano sent out a hashtag on Twitter with Me Too, asking people who had experienced sexual violence to reply Me Too to her tweet. She wrote that if all women who have been sexually harassed or assaulted wrote Me Too as a status, we might give people a sense of the magnitude of the problem. Now, there are obviously many reasons and causes of sexual harassment that are beyond the focus of this class. But what is clear is that in many of these cases, women felt victimized by different power structures between men and women that have been systemic over decades, if not centuries. And so just as we tried to understand the foundations of the Black Lives Matter movement, or NFL players protesting continued racism and inequality in the United States as part of the larger struggle for equality, we need to do the same with women and other minorities in this country. This lecture, I'm going to focus on women's rights and gendered roles. So up until the mid-19th century, the ideal of separate spheres had dominated relations between the sexes, especially among middle-class Americans. The male sphere was one of work, politics, and public events. The female sphere, by contrast, was one of domesticity, moral education, and child rearing. Men and women were not supposed to intrude into each other's spheres. It was unnatural for women to work outside the home, to enter the corrupting world of politics, or to engage in pleasurable sex. It was equally unnatural for men to devote themselves to child rearing, or to concern themselves with domestic chores. This doctrine of separate spheres frustrated increasingly educated women who wanted to work and play outside the home. It also meant that men and women spent substantial portions of their daily lives apart from each other. The ceremonial occasions, meals, and leisure activities that brought them together tended to be closely regulated. The lives of the young, in particular, were closely watched, guided, and supervised by parents, teachers, and ministers. One woman who challenged this idea of separate spheres was Elizabeth Cady Stanton. In 1848, Stanton organized the first women's rights convention in Seneca Falls, New York, kicking off a decades-long struggle for gender equality. There, Stanton helped write the Declaration of Sentiments, a document modeled after the Declaration of Independence that spelled out the rights of American women and offered examples of how men had oppressed women, including preventing them from voting, owning property, or getting a college education. She also declared in the Declaration of Sentiments that men had authority in divorce and child custody proceedings and decisions, which also was seen as unequal. After the Civil War, women continued to pick up where the Seneca Falls Convention left off by challenging the separate sphere ideal in a variety of ways. The war presented women with new responsibilities and duties, typically considered outside the accepted norms of the time. For example, with their brothers, fathers, and husbands away at war, women in the North and South ran farms and plantations and oversaw family businesses. Countless other women joined aid societies, sewed uniforms, and raised money for the war effort. And still others became nurses, which had, up until the Civil War, become a predominantly male-dominant occupation, as many army surgeons did not believe that hospitals were appropriate places for women and thought that women were unable to handle the rigors of the job. But, as we will see throughout the class, wars often change these typical gender roles. Women like Dorothea Dix, pictured here, spearheaded a wave of women into the nursing profession. By the end of the war, between 5,000 and 10,000 women had volunteered as nurses. Perhaps the biggest movement to transform the separate spheres ideal came during the Industrial Revolution and the advance of corporate capitalism, which created a tremendous demand for office workers to handle clerical, bookkeeping, and administrative tasks. By today's standards, these jobs may appear as small progress, but for women who were once limited chiefly to the home or to factory labor, and domestic service, these white-collar jobs put many women in closer contact with men outside the home on a daily basis and showed the value of their work. In 1870, a mere 2,000 women worked in offices, only 2% of all office employees, but by 1920, women held 45% of all clerical jobs, making this the most common middle-class female occupation. At Sears Roebuck, women office workers made up more than half of all Sears office employees by 1913 and handled the company's billing, typing, and stenography. Women also replaced men as telephone operators because they purportedly did not talk back to callers and accepted lower wages. Department stores not only served increasing numbers of female customers, but they also hired women to work the counters that were once reserved for male clerks. And the federal government during this time began to employ a large number of women clerks. With fewer options, many women welcomed the new opportunities for office jobs and their ability to work outside the home and contribute to their family's finances. Josephine Waller, for example, the daughter of a prominent Philadelphia physician, went to work to support her family upon the death of her father. She took jobs as a teacher and a governess, finally gaining a position in the government in 1890. She married a few years later, but retained her government post because she supported her disabled husband and her sister. While some employers had reservations about hiring women, the supply of educated women grew as the need for white-collar office workers expanded. Office work quickly became a respectable occupation for middle-class females. Now, of course, just because women were stepping out of the home to take new roles, it did not mean that there was equality in the workplace. In many offices, employers paid men and women different wages, even if they performed the same work. Indeed, lower-paid women sometimes performed the same tasks as better-paid men. Employers also accepted women as office workers because they assumed women would work for only a few years before getting married. Therefore, they would not expect promotions and career advancement and could be paid less than men. Henry Ford, founder of the Ford Motor Company, required his women office workers to be unmarried. Women were the largest group to take advantage of job opportunities during World War I. About 1 million women joined the paid labor force for the first time, while another 8 million gave up low-wage service jobs for higher-paying industrial work. Americans soon got used to the sight of female streetcar conductors, train engineers, and defense workers. Though most people expected these jobs to return to men in peacetime, the war created a new comfort level with women's employment outside the home. Outside of office work, women in the late 19th century also joined clubs and took stands on public affairs, making many women some of the leading reformers of the day. Many female reformers worked for factory inspection, regulation of children's and women's labor, and improved housing and consumer protection. Other elite women financed settlement houses and organizations like the Young Women's Christian Association, which aided unmarried working women. Between 1886 and 1910, over 400 settlements were established, mostly in big cities, sponsoring activities such as English language classes, kindergartens and nurseries, health clinics, vocational training, playgrounds, and art exhibits. We'll get into settlement houses in a little bit more detail when we talk about the progressive movement in a few weeks, as settlements became the vanguard of progressivism. Perhaps two of the most famous progressive reformers of the day were Jane Addams, who founded Hull House on Chicago's West Side in 1889, and Lillian Wald, founder of the Henry Street Settlement in New York. Hull House was typical in offering a bathhouse, playground, kindergarten, and daycare center. Some settlements opened libraries and gymnasiums, I can't say that word. Others operated penny savings banks and cooperative kitchens where tired mothers could purchase a meal at the end of the day. At the Henry Street Settlement in New York, Lillian Wald organized visiting nurses to improve health in tenement wards. Settlements offered idealistic young people a place where they could live as neighbors and give as much as they could of what they had, and it gave women an important voice in their surrounding communities. Around 1910, some people concerned with women's place in society began using the term feminism. Whereas the women's movement spoke of moral purity, feminists emphasized rights and self-development. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, a major figure in the movement, declared in her book Women and Economics that domesticity and purity were obsolete, and she attacked men's monopoly on economic opportunity. It was Gilman's belief that paid employees should handle domestic chores such as cooking, cleaning, and childcare, giving women greater freedom to take jobs and to be independent. The anarchist Emma Goldman, seen here in Union Square, echoed these themes by denouncing marriage as a kind of prostitution, and she embraced the ideal of free love, unburdened by contractual commitment. Several feminists joined the birth control movement led by Margaret Sanger, a former visiting nurse who believed in women's rights to sexual pleasure and to determine when to have a child. Sanger helped reverse state and federal laws banning distribution of information about sex and contraception. Opposition came from those who saw birth control as a threat to family and morality. Sanger also was a eugenicist who perceived birth control as a means of limiting the numbers of children born to inferior immigrant and non-white mothers. In 1921, she formed the American Birth Control League, enlisting physicians and social workers to convince judges to allow distribution of birth control information. Most states still prohibited the sale of contraceptives, but Sanger provoked public debate. These women were among the first to use the term feminism to describe their desire for equality with men. Some of them came together in the Greenwich Village, a community of radical artists and writers in Lower Manhattan, where they founded a supportive environment in which to express and live by their feminist ideals. The movement for sexual and gender equality aroused anxiety among American conservatives. Parents worried about the promiscuity of their children. Conservatives were certain that the new women would transform American cities into dens of inequity. Vice commissions sprang up in every major city to clamp down on prostitution, drunkenness, and pornography. Despite new roles as feminists, leading reformers, and stepping into new jobs, many women saw the ultimate sign of equality by gaining the right to vote. The suffrage crusade was conducted by two organizations, the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association. Led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, the Women's Suffrage Association called for a constitutional amendment giving women the vote. Thousands of young, college-educated women campaigned door to door, held impromptu rallies, and pressed state legislatures to grant this right. Wyoming, which attained statehood in 1890, became the first state to grant women the right to vote, followed in 1893 by Colorado and in 1896 by Idaho and Utah. The main reason for success in these sparsely populated western states was not egalitarianism, but rather the conviction that women's supposedly gentler and more nurturing nature would tame and civilize the rawness of the frontier. Still, these states opened the door for women's vote across the country, and support in these states reflected a subtle but important change in the suffrage movement. Earlier generations had insisted that women were fundamentally equal to men, but many of the new suffragettes argued that women were different from men. Women, they stressed, possessed a moral and a sense and a nurturing quality that men lacked. Consequently, they understood the civic obligations implied by the franchise and could be trusted to vote virtuously. Their experience as mothers and household managers, moreover, would enable them to guide local and state governments in efforts to improve education, sanitation, and the condition of women and children in the workforce. Suffragettes were, somewhat surprisingly, slow to ally themselves with blacks, Asians, and other disfranchised groups. In fact, many suffragettes, especially those in the South and West, opposed the franchise for Americans of color. They, like their male counterparts, believed that members of these groups lacked reason and morality and thus did not deserve the vote. Washington, California, Kansas, Oregon, and Arizona followed the lead of the other western states by enfranchising women in the years from 1910 to 1912. After a series of setbacks in eastern and midwestern states, the movement regained momentum under the leadership of Carrie Chapman Catt, who became president of the Women's Suffrage Association in 1915, and the radical Alice Paul, who founded the militant National Women's Party. In 1913, Paul led a massive parade in Washington, D.C., one day before the inauguration of President Woodrow Wilson. 8,000 marchers participated in the event as women from across the country called for a constitutional amendment guaranteeing women the vote. Marchers were jostled and ridiculed by many in the crowd who opposed the women's movement. Some were tripped, others assaulted. Policemen appeared to be either indifferent to the struggling paraders or sympathetic to the mob. Before the day was out, 100 marchers had been hospitalized. The mistreatment of the marchers amplified the event and the cause into a major news story and led to congressional hearings where the D.C. superintendent of police lost his job. But the women's efforts were not in vain. President Woodrow Wilson endorsed suffrage in 1916, understanding the important role that women played during the First World War, which became the central event of his second term in office. As the war came to an end, Wilson linked suffrage for women to the war's aims in a speech in 1918, stating, "We have made women partners in the war. Shall we admit them only to partnership of suffering and sacrifice and toil, and not to partnership of privilege and right?" Following Wilson's lead and the continued efforts of suffragettes, the House passed the suffrage amendment in 1918 and the Senate early the following year. The 19th Amendment to the Constitution granted American women the right to vote and was ratified on August 18, 1920, ending almost a century of protest. Less than 3 months later, on November 2, 1920, for the first time in history, more than 8 million American women went to the polls and exercised their right to vote in precincts all over America. Thomas Jefferson had proclaimed equality the bedrock of American government, but it had taken 144 years for women to finally achieve full citizenship in the United States. And the women who led the charge, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, unfortunately had not lived long enough to cast a ballot themselves. But as we will see in the next lecture, winning the vote was only a step. Discrimination in employment, education, and law continued to shadow women for decades.